The non-dual understanding, in whatever tradition it is formulated, can be distilled into a single sentence, namely that in spite of the appearance of multiplicity and diversity, reality is one. This one reality cannot ultimately be named or defined, because it is that in terms of which, or with reference to which, everything else is defined. It cannot ultimately be named, but in order to satisfy as a concession, to satisfy our desire to speak of it, it has been named God or the Godhead, Allah, Brahman, consciousness, spirit, love, and so on. In their wisdom and humility, the ancient masters simply referred to it as not to, preferring to say what it is not, rather than trying to say what it is, and in this way preventing it from ever coming within the confines of the finite mind. However, whether we concede to give it a name or prefer to leave it unnamed, all that is necessary is to recognize this one reality in spite of the appearance of multiplicity and diversity, and to lead a life to the best of our ability in a way that is consistent with and an expression of this recognition. what are the implications of this recognition of the one reality whose nature is spirit or love or consciousness? The first implication is that if reality is one, there can be nothing in itself other than itself. For if there was something in itself other than itself, that thing would be a second reality. And reality would then no longer be one. Having nothing in itself other than itself, there can be no divisions within it. There may be divisions in the forms of its appearance, but in itself there can be no divisions. Any division would be like a wall made of space appearing in space, or a white line drawn on a white page, which is of course no real division. The one reality is as such indivisible. It appears to be divided into parts, objects, and selves. But that is just the way it appears from a localized perspective. In itself, there is nothing in itself other than itself with which it could be divided into parts or objects or selves. having nothing in itself other than itself. The one cannot have a boundary, because a boundary would demark what it is from what it is not. And if there was something that it is not, then there would be something other than the one, in which case the one would not be one. Being indivisible and unbounded, it is sometimes said to be infinite. But to suggest that it is infinite means that it is not finite. It is to compare it with something that is finite. But in reality there is nothing finite in the one with which it could be compared. And thus we cannot even say that it is infinite. To call it infinite is to collude with the idea that there are finite things. The idea that the one is infinite is a halfway stage in understanding that is used to remove the idea that reality is finite. Once that idea or belief has been removed, we should abandon the idea that it is infinite. The idea that reality is infinite is like a thorn that is used to remove a thorn. Both must be thrown away. Please don't think about what I am saying. If you don't understand it, just forget it. If you do understand it, let this understanding percolate from your mind into your heart. And allow this understanding to work in you without your having to do anything about it. Having nothing in itself other than itself, the one knows no other. And this absence of otherness is the experience that we feel as love. The experience of love is not, as such, an emotion that one person feels for or towards another. It is the absence, the collapse of self and other. In other words, the experience of love is a revelation of reality, filtering into our human experience. as a concession to the separate individual, we may say that love is the felt sense of our shared reality or being. It is the one appearing as two. It is for this reason that friendship, which is of course an expression of love, is in this approach itself considered to be a vehicle of this understanding, a pathway in its own right. The one never appears or begins, because anything that appears must appear or arise in something that precedes it. And if there was something prior to the one out of which the one could arise or appear, then there would be something other than the one. And then the one would not be one. God would not be God. Likewise, the one never disappears or comes to an end. For if the one disappeared, it would have to disappear into something that was other than itself, and that existed in the absence of itself. And that, whatever the one disappeared into, would have to be greater than the one in order to be able to contain it. This would render the one finite, limited, temporary, in which case the one would no longer be the one. God would no longer be God. Thus, in its own experience of itself, the one knows nothing of appearance and disappearance. That is, it knows nothing of birth and death. In the one's own experience of itself, it is as such eternal, not everlasting in time, for there is no time present in which the one might last. For if the one appeared and lasted in time, time would precede the one and be greater than the one. And the one would be a limited appearance within it. In the one's own experience of itself, it is eternal. Do not try to think of eternity. Eternity, filtered through thought, appears as time. The eternal, filtered through thought, appears as the everlasting. The one is ever present, not everlasting. The best the finite mind can do when thinking of eternity is to conceive of the present moment, now. The idea of a present moment is the finite mind's attempt to bring the eternal within its own narrow compass. It is the finite mind. It is the finite mind's attempt to reconcile its belief in time with the experience of eternity. The present moment is as such. The place where the finite and the infinite intersect. It is the place where the horizontal line of time and the vertical dimension of eternity touch one another. It is for this reason that the present moment is considered a portal for the finite mind, through which it passes out of time into eternity. Please don't try to understand what I am saying. Just let it go into your heart and do its work there. For the one, there is no experience of space, because space always implies distance. And for the one, there is no distance between itself and itself. So we cannot ultimately even say that the one is everywhere. For there is no everywhere. for the one to pervade. The idea that the one is everywhere is a thorn that is used to remove the thorn. That is the belief that the one is somewhere, located in a particular person, in a particular object, a particular thing. But having removed the idea that the one is somewhere, we should abandon the idea that the one is everywhere. The idea that the one is everywhere is as far as the mind can go. Beyond that understanding, the mind cannot venture. Have you noticed that all your experience takes place at the place we call here? Have you noticed that we never find the place we call there? For whenever we reach over there, it is still always here. Have you ever left the place called here? The idea of here is where the finite and the infinite intersect. For the finite, here is a place in space. For the infinite, the same here is its own dimensionless presence. Don't work on this understanding. Let it work on you. One of the oldest questions in philosophy is the question as to how something comes out of nothing. And the question has still not been satisfactorily answered. And the reason for this is that the question is predicated on the assumption of things. It starts with the idea of things. How does something come out of nothing? Having started with the idea of things, we presume that what things come out of must itself be not a thing or nothing. But from the point of view of the One, there are no things. And therefore the idea of not a thing or nothing makes no sense. From the point of view of the One, there is neither something, nor nothing, nor everything. There is just itself. The One does not come out of anything, nor does anything come out of it. There is just itself, modulating itself in the forms of all that seems to be, without ever ceasing to be itself. However, as a concession to the separate self that we believe and feel ourselves to be, it is legitimate to say that there is no place, no experience where the One is not. That everything, literally everything, is that. The good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the just and the unjust, the cruel and the kind, the beautiful and the ugly. At the level of appearances, there must be opposites. But for the one, there are no such opposites. The one knows nothing of good, bad, right, wrong, and so on. What is the separate self? It is a contraction of the one within the one, made only of the one. However, with this contraction of the one within itself, the one seems to localize and, as a result, limit itself. From the point of view of this contracted self, there is good, bad, right, wrong, and so on. Being a contraction of the one, this apparently separate self considers itself, feels itself to be a fragment. As such, it feels incomplete, imperfect. And is, as a result, always seeking to fulfill itself or complete itself by merging with an object, substance, activity, relationship, and so on. It does not really seek any of these things for their own sake. The separate self seeks these things in order to merge with them and thus lose its apparent boundary and to return to the one. It is for this reason that love and sorrow are so closely associated in our experience. Because love is all the separate self, or the apparently separate self, really wants. That is, all the separate self really wants is to be divested of its apparent limitations and to be returned as such to the one. For this reason, the separate self can never experience the love for which it longs. It can only merge or die into it. In other words, the separate self can never have what it wants. It can only become what it wants. Just as the moth can never experience the flame, it must become the flame. The separate self is not really an entity in its own right. There are no entities in the one. There is only itself. It is rather a tension of seeking and resisting, through which a separate self seems to be, through which an entity or self seems to be separated out from the whole. Once this apparently separate self has been separated out from the whole through the activities of seeking and resisting, it embarks on a great search. Of which the search for enlightenment is simply the final step, the final stage. But the entire search, even the search for enlightenment, perpetuates the idea of a self apart from the one, who might finally become enlightened. The spiritual path is really the unwinding of this search, the unwinding of the impulse of seeking and resisting. The great search is, in other words, destined to failure. What we really seek lies at the source of our seeking. It can never be found at the destiny of our search. Prayer or meditation is really the decontracting of the separate self sense. the dissolution of the impulse of seeking and resisting. Any effort we make simply perpetuates the sense of a self who is making an effort in order to achieve something in the future. But for the one, there is only itself. All it encounters is always itself. And therefore there is no sense in it of becoming, achieving, acquiring, realizing. The whole idea of enlightenment is predicated on the idea that there is some experience that is not the one and that needs to be replaced or avoided or improved. Any impulse at all to leave or avoid our current experience is predicated on the belief that this experience is not the one. In other words, any desire to leave or replace our current experience is a denial of God's being. True spiritual practice is not a practice. The spiritual path is not a path. There is no pathway from the one to the one. There is no practice that could make the one more present than it is now. There is no endarkening or concealing of the one, and therefore there is no enlightenment for the one. There is nothing in the one other than itself with which it could be veiled or endarkened. And thus the whole enlightenment adventure is a concession to the belief and feeling that we are other than the One, or that there is something other than the One. That's why Utpaladeva, one of the great sages of the Kashmir tradition, said, "Due to my immersion in you, may I be free from the desire for anything other than what is. May I be utterly filled with delight, considering everyone and everything that I encounter as consisting only of you." Nothing can ever be added to the One to enhance it. Nothing can ever be removed from it to diminish it. In its own experience of itself, it is whole, perfect, complete. And this wholeness, perfection and completion is the experience that we know as happiness. This is the great happiness, which has no cause in experience, and for which there is no opposite. as this understanding sinks more and more deeply into our hearts, the tension of seeking and resisting gradually unwinds. And we find ourselves at peace for no reason. And in time we begin to notice a transformation taking place in our activities and relationships. We no longer use the world in service of our peace and happiness. We use our peace and happiness in service of the world.